The hangar smelled of oil and rusted metal. Beneath a broken skylight, a wrecked B-24 Liberator lay silent, its silver skin torn open like the ribs of a fallen giant. Around it stood 3 German engineers, Captain Otto Weiss, Lieutenant Friedrich Lenz, and civilian designer Ernst Vogel, all once masters of their trade in Messerschmitt's workshops. Their hands, still trembling with pride and disbelief, now reached toward a foreign creation. An American fuel tank, dented but intact, hung from a steel beam like an organ cut from a body. They had been told to study it, to learn what makes it live. But as the first bolts came loose and the metallic plates peeled away, Weiss whispered something that made the American guards glance at one another. They store power like a heartbeat. Inside the tank's hollow chamber, the Germans saw more than pipes and rivets. There was rhythm. The structure pulsed with purpose. Each valve seemed placed to time the aircraft's breathing. Each partition was designed to control the pulse of its blood, the fuel. The engineers realized that every drop of gasoline that flowed through those channels had once pushed a bomber across oceans, feeding the engines like veins feeding muscle. Weiss had designed fuel lines before the war, but this was different. The Americans had turned the fuel system into something alive. It was not just a storage unit, it was a circulatory system of flight. Every compartment of the tank worked in harmony, ensuring balance, pressure, and endurance. Even the welds glowed faintly where sunlight struck through the hangar's cracked roof, like capillaries catching light under skin. Lenz paused, his fingers brushing the reinforced rim. "Every beat of this heart," he murmured, "kept a city awake under fire." Around him, the air was still. The sound of their tools echoed like surgical instruments in an operating room. In that silence, the Germans began to understand why the Americans called their machines liberators. Not only because they dropped bombs, but because they embodied something beyond destruction, the mastery of energy itself. For the first time, the captured engineers looked at the bomber not as an enemy, but as a living being whose power came from control, precision, and pulse. Outside, the afternoon light bled through the hangar doors, and the 3 men stood motionless, facing that mechanical heart. The war was still raging across the oceans, but here, in a forgotten workshop of Oklahoma, they had met something that breathed. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. The dismantling began at dawn. With gloved hands, Captain Otto Weiss loosened the final bolts that held the B-24's fuel tank to its cradle. As it dropped gently to the hangar floor, the metallic thud reverberated like a pulse fading away. The 3 engineers knelt, surrounded by scattered wrenches and bits of torn aluminum. For men who once designed aircraft that terrorized Europe, this was a moment of quiet humiliation, yet also deep fascination. Lieutenant Friedrich Lenz ran his fingers across the inner wall of the tank and froze. The surface wasn't bare metal as he expected. It was lined with layered coatings, fabric, rubber, resin, each applied with machine-like precision. "It's not a simple steel drum," he muttered in disbelief. "It's engineered to think." Underneath the dull gray lining, they uncovered a labyrinth of components, partition walls dividing the tank into compartments, return lines looping back to equalize flow, vent valves shaped like miniature lungs, and an elastic material that looked oddly organic. One American technician, a young corporal named James "Jimmy" Carver, watched them curiously from a workbench nearby. When Lenz asked, through the interpreter, what this strange material was, Jimmy smiled and said simply, "Self-sealing. You shoot it, it heals." The Germans stared. In 1944, few Luftwaffe planes carried true self-sealing tanks. They were too costly and too complex. Yet here, inside a bomber built in thousands, the Americans had perfected it. Each tank had multiple protective layers, vulcanized rubber that expanded when pierced, trapping leaking fuel, preventing explosions. The system was crude in appearance, but brilliant in function. Simple enough for mass production, sophisticated enough to save lives. Weiss scribbled in his notebook, his handwriting tight and hurried. Redundant valves, dual-line feed, self-sealing compound, intelligent compartmentation. He had never seen so many safety redundancies combined in a single unit. Vogel, who had once designed high-altitude tanks for the Heinkel He-177, looked almost insulted by the simplicity. "They build as if failure is expected," he whispered, "and yet they survive because of it." Jimmy leaned closer, tapping the outer shell of the tank. "Each of these," he said, "is tested under pressure before it leaves the plant. No leaks allowed. The women in the assembly line call them the babies." That casual remark lingered in the air. The Germans exchanged glances. Women building life-saving systems? In Germany, such precision work belonged to master craftsmen, not to civilians in kerchiefs. It was a quiet revelation. The fuel tank they held was not merely a product of engineering, it was a vessel of collective labor, of millions working together to keep the machine and the nation alive. When they lifted one of the internal plates, light shimmered across the sealant layer like veins under translucent skin. In that strange reflection, the engineers saw something more unsettling than technology. They saw a society that built not just for war, but for endurance. By mid-morning, the German engineers had arranged the dismantled fuel system in a long line across the hangar floor. It stretched almost 10 meters, aluminum, rubber, copper, and brass, a dissected artery of flight. The air smelled faintly of gasoline, sweet and sharp. Captain Weiss stood over it, arms folded, his mind turning from structure to strategy. For the first time, he began to understand what this heart truly meant. Each gallon in that system was not just fuel, it was distance. The B-24's range was its invisible weapon. At maximum load, it could carry around 2,300 gallons of fuel, enough to fly nearly 2,000 miles. With auxiliary tanks installed in its bomb bay, it could cross oceans, escort convoys, and strike at targets far beyond the reach of Axis aircraft. Those extra tanks, those hidden extensions of the bomber's veins, were what made it more than just a machine. They made it a long-armed predator. Lieutenant Lenz traced one of the feed lines on the floor and whispered, almost to himself, "Every liter here is a step across the Atlantic." He wasn't exaggerating. To bomb Ploiești, to reach Burma, or to patrol the North Atlantic, Allied bombers relied on tanks like this, and on the infrastructure that filled them. In Germany, fuel shortages had grounded squadrons. Here, the Americans had solved that weakness with pure industrial scale. The interpreter handed Weiss a printed leaflet, captured intelligence from the Americans themselves, boasting that the Willow Run plant produced one Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. He let out a bitter laugh. To him, that number sounded like blasphemy against the old gods of craftsmanship. But deep down, he knew it was the new gospel of war. When they examined the smaller auxiliary tanks, Vogel noticed an ingenious feature: quick disconnect couplings and standardized mounts. These allowed crews to install or remove tanks in hours, depending on mission range. Germany's long-range bombers had no such flexibility. Each redesign required rebalancing the airframe, recalculating lift, and modifying fuel lines, a process that could take weeks. The Americans had industrialized adaptability itself. The gossip inside the camp later that evening revolved around this discovery. Some prisoners whispered that the Americans wasted materials, others that they had tapped a kind of secret energy. Weiss, more thoughtful, told a younger engineer, "They've turned mobility into a strategy. They win not by reaching farther, but by planning to reach anywhere." As the sun set, the hangar grew warm and gold, light pooling across the gleaming metal. Lenz crouched and looked along the length of the disassembled fuel line, a silver serpent shimmering on the floor. In that moment, he realized what they had been fighting, not just a country, but a system that made even fuel a weapon of logistics. Far away, Allied bombers roared across the sky, their silhouettes faint against the horizon. Inside each one, gallons of fuel pulsed through identical tanks. invisible lifeblood, carrying not just fire, but reach, endurance, and will. When they peeled back the final layer of the B-24's tank, a strange scent filled the air, a mix of burnt rubber and engine oil. The German engineers froze. Beneath the aluminum shell was a dark, flexible membrane stitched into place with rivets and coated in tar-black sealant. It looked almost like skin. Weiss bent down, pressing a gloved finger into it. The surface gave slightly and then slowly returned to shape. "Self-sealing," he whispered. "It breathes." Lieutenant Lenz had heard rumors of such tanks, but he had never touched one. During the war, Luftwaffe pilots often burned to death when bullets punctured their fuel lines. Even a single tracer round could turn a plane into a torch. Yet here was a material that refused to surrender. When pierced, its layers of vulcanized rubber and treated fabric expanded, closing around the hole, choking the fire before it began. The Americans had created a breathing barrier, a heartbeat that healed itself. Vogel, the quietest of the three, knelt beside the open tank. "They've given their machines lungs," he murmured. In his diary that night, he would write, "The tank felt alive, as if it resisted death." The American technician Jimmy Carver returned, holding a cutaway sample. He showed them how the inner layers swelled when soaked in fuel, sealing even small punctures. "Saves lives every day," he said softly, almost with pride. "Even when we take hits, the tank fights back." The Germans stared at the fragment in awe. To them, safety was a luxury. In wartime Germany, protection was sacrificed for speed. Yet here, inside the tank of a mass-produced bomber, the Americans had built resilience into the design. They planned for damage, expected chaos, and engineered survival. Weiss thought of the pilots who must have trusted this system. Men flying over flak-filled skies, hearing the thud of shells, and knowing their lifeline was sealed beneath them. Each drop of fuel became more than energy. It was endurance against annihilation. Later that evening, as darkness spread across the camp, the three engineers sat outside their barracks, watching the floodlights hum over the fences. Lenz broke the silence. "We built for perfection," he said. "They build for forgiveness." Weiss nodded. "And maybe that's why they last longer." A gust of wind rattled the barbed wire, and for a moment, the rhythmic hum of the distant power station blended with the pounding of their own hearts. Steady, mechanical, unbroken. Inside that forgotten Oklahoma hangar, a torn fuel tank had revealed more than technology. It had shown them a truth that no propaganda could erase. Survival itself could be engineered. The following morning, the engineers gathered around the reassembled tank, now half restored, its panels propped up by wooden braces. A faint light spilled through the hangar's rafters, illuminating the intricate lattice of valves, baffles, and vent lines. Lieutenant Lenz took a step back to admire it, then said quietly, "It's like they built a cathedral for fuel." He wasn't wrong. The structure inside was mesmerizing in its order. Every compartment had a purpose. Baffle plates divided the tank to prevent sloshing during sharp turns or dives. Air vents regulated pressure at high altitude. Crossfeed valves maintained balance between the left and right wings. Even the drainage ports were positioned with mathematical precision. It was a kind of choreography. Every molecule of fuel moved according to rhythm and design. When the Americans explained the testing standards, the Germans could scarcely believe it. Every B-24 tank was pressure tested, leak checked, then submerged in fluid to detect even the smallest imperfection. Any defect meant scrapping the entire unit. The Americans' obsession with uniformity bordered on the fanatical, yet the results spoke for themselves. Jimmy Carver approached with a clipboard. "You know what's funny?" he said with a grin. "Half the girls who make these tanks don't even know what a B-24 looks like." The words hung in the air like a small shock. Women, working hundreds of miles from the front, building the lungs of bombers they would never see. Captain Weiss smiled faintly, not out of condescension, but from realization. "They've industrialized trust," he murmured. "Each worker believes the next will do her part." That sentence would stay with him for decades. At lunch, a rumor spread through the camp that the Americans were already producing a newer bomber with even greater range, the B-29. Some POWs laughed it off as exaggeration. Others claimed they'd seen photos. The discussion turned heated. Vogel insisted that no machine could fly that far with full bomb load. There's a limit to what wings can carry, he argued. Lenz countered, and yet they keep finding ways to move the limit. Their arguments weren't about airplanes anymore. They were about identity, about whether precision was still the soul of engineering, or if the new age belonged to those who could build millions of identical miracles. That night, lying in their bunks, Weiss could still picture the tank's inner chambers. He thought of German designers hand-polishing fuel injectors, while American workers, thousands strong, welded parts under fluorescent light, laughing over tin cups of coffee. He wondered which world would endure after the war, the one of perfection or the one of production. And then he asked himself the same question I'll ask you. When it comes to survival, in war or in peace, what truly matters more, precision or resilience? By the fifth day, the engineers were no longer just examining a machine, they were tracing an entire organism. The B-24's fuel system, laid bare across the hangar floor, resembled a map of arteries. Tanks, pumps, valves, and filters, all linked by gleaming conduits. Captain Weiss followed one copper line with his hand, watching where it split into 2, then 4, then disappeared beneath the engine mounts. "It's alive," he said softly. "Every pipe has a pulse." The Americans had connected everything in perfect sequence. Primary and auxiliary tanks, booster pumps, gravity-fed reserves, crossfeed lines, and vent manifolds. Redundant systems ensured that even if one section failed, the others could still sustain flight. It was engineering philosophy turned into survival instinct, a machine built to refuse death. Jimmy Carver handed them a schematic printed on waxed paper, its title block reading Consolidated Aircraft Corporation, San Diego, 1943. The Germans unrolled it on a crate and stared at the flowing lines. "This isn't just plumbing," said Vogel, astonished. "It's anatomy." Lenz traced the diagram with a pencil, noting how each component was labeled, every bolt standardized. "They build so that any mechanic, anywhere, could fix this system," he muttered. "In our factories, that would take a specialist." Weiss looked up at him. "And that's why they can fight on every continent." Outside the hangar, a train whistle blew. Another shipment of war material heading east. The Americans had built not just planes, but the arteries that fed them. Tankers carried aviation fuel from Texas refineries to coastal airfields, pipelines snaked under forests and deserts. Every droplet of gasoline was part of a grand design, a living network that reached from the oil fields to the skies. That night, as the engineers gathered in their barracks, they argued again. Some said America's strength lay in resources. Others said it was organization. But for Weiss, the truth was more intimate. "They build machines as we build organs," he said quietly. "Each part nourishes the next. It's not strength, it's harmony." Later, Jimmy passed by their bunkhouse, leaving behind a small tin lunchbox filled with biscuits and a folded note. "Built this myself. Not much, but it holds together." Lenz stared at it for a long time before whispering, "Even their food containers are part of their culture." Perhaps that was the real lesson. Engineering wasn't just steel and equations. It was a language of cooperation, from the worker who bent metal to the pilot who trusted the invisible flow beneath his feet. And for you watching this now, do you think our modern machines still have that heartbeat? Or have we forgotten the pulse behind progress? Tell us what you believe in the comments. 2 months later, the engineers were told they would soon be repatriated. The war was nearly over. Yet in the final days of their confinement, the Americans offered them a visit, one last inspection at a nearby air depot where a restored B-24 stood glinting beneath the Texas sun. Its engines had been removed, but its body shone like polished mercury. When the group stepped inside, silence took hold. The narrow catwalks, the bomb bay doors, the ribbed fuselage, everything seemed alive with memory. Weiss led the way to the wing route, where a new fuel tank had been installed for demonstration. It was spotless, gleaming with sealant, each valve marked with serial numbers and inspection stamps. The system they had studied in fragments now stood whole again, breathing as one. Vogel ran a hand over the smooth surface. "It's like touching a living creature," he whispered. The American supervisor nodded. "You could say that. Without this, she'd never leave the ground." As they circled the bomber, the memories of their first disassembly flooded back. The burnt rubber smell, the confusion, the reluctant awe. Only now did they fully understand what they had seen. The B-24 was not merely an instrument of war. It was a declaration of how deeply a nation could organize itself around motion, endurance, and belief. Every bolt, every tank, every gallon of fuel had carried intent to reach farther, to last longer, to survive. Before leaving, Weiss took out his small notebook. On its last page, he wrote, "Fuel equals faith. In these tanks, they store not just power, but will." Then he closed it, knowing he would never design aircraft again. Outside, the heat shimmered across the tarmac. The engineers stood together, watching a line of American mechanics eating sandwiches beside the aircraft. One of them had drawn a heart on the aluminum skin with chalk, around the point where the fuel line entered the wing. No one noticed it but the Germans. For a long while, they said nothing. The hangar doors creaked open behind them, letting in a breath of wind that passed through the empty fuselage, humming softly, like a low mechanical heartbeat. Weiss exhaled, almost a prayer. "They store power like a heartbeat," he murmured once more, but this time it was not a statement of surprise. It was a confession of respect. When those German engineers boarded the train home, the war had already become a memory of ash and silence. Yet somewhere in the clutter of their minds remained the image of that fuel tank, the metallic heart that pulsed behind America's industrial triumph. They had come expecting to find crude strength, and instead discovered precision, born from unity, compassion stitched into machinery, and foresight built into every valve. In their notebooks lay technical drawings, but between the lines lay something more human, the realization that survival in modern war was not achieved by brilliance alone, but by cooperation, humility, and faith in the collective. The B-24's tank became their symbol of that lesson. It breathed when struck, sealed itself when wounded, and continued to feed life into motion. Years later, when peace returned and engines once again filled the skies, one of them would tell his grandson, "Machines can carry blood too, if people build them with purpose." And in that quiet admission, history exhaled. Because even in the ruins of war, something endures. The heartbeat of ingenuity, steady and human, echoing through every tank that ever carried not just fuel, but hope.